Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen, and welcome to Day 4 of RPG A Day 2021, where we're going to be taking a look at the prompt weapon. Weapons, and of course combat along with them, are really an integral part in just about every tabletop role-playing game out there. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a tabletop role-playing game that doesn't include an armory and combat in some form. And because of this, weapons are one of those things that across tabletop RPGs that can be extremely varied, not just in their form, but also their function and their general place in the particular game that you are playing. Just as a basic example, you could have a game like Pathfinder, where there are literally dozens of weapons shared across all of the different splat books in Pathfinder 1st Edition. The same is true, of course, of D&D 3rd Edition, which was the predecessor to Pathfinder 1e. And each of these weapons is going to have a different set of stats to accompany it, everything from different damage types to different damage dice to different damage maximums and minimums, critical threat ranges, special abilities that they can do, special unique effects to each individual weapon type. Or conversely, you could have a system like Maze Rats that's a lot more simplified, and Maze Rats is what I'm using to run my current weekend campaign. Maze Rats doesn't provide a huge variety of weapons that deal different types of damage or have special critical threat ranges and this, that, and the other. Really, in Maze Rats, there's only 3 types of weapons: one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, and ranged weapons, and that's it. The damage they deal doesn't really vary too much, and the variance tends more to be in how the players and the game masters flavor those weapons, and whether or not the weapons are going to allow you to use a shield or require you to use both of your hands. Really, the most notable difference between the different weapon types in Maze Rats are, of course, that ranged weapons require 2 hands and are ranged, so you're not going to be right up in the fray, you don't risk as much. One-handed weapons will enable you to use a shield along with them, which will give you better defense, and two-handed melee weapons deal 1 extra point of damage because they're bigger and they hit harder, generally speaking. So just like anything else in the tabletop gaming hobby, weapons fall into a spectrum depending on the kind of game you're playing, the kind of game you like to play, the system that it's in, and so on and so forth. But where do I stand on that? What is my preferred way to incorporate weapons into my games? How do I like to utilize them? Well, for myself, I kind of like to use something of a mixed model. I'm not overly fond of weapons lists that have these extensive breakdowns of the different stats that weapons have and all of these wide variances right down to the individual little minutiae, but I do like there to be some sort of variance. I do like certain weapons to have advantages over other weapons, and these weapons should have advantages that are situational. After all, that's why the different kinds of weapons that we use were designed the way they were, to gain situational advantages and provide protection in different situations. And I personally enjoy it when my tabletop games can reflect that, so my personal preference is to keep things like the damage ranges and critical threat and all that stuff relatively simple, but have it so that the weapons have different properties that are unique to them that give them advantages and disadvantages in certain situations. For example, spears are often considered to actually be historically one of the best melee weapons you can use because the reach they provide enables a greater amount of defense for yourself, since you can keep opponents at bay more easily. The same, of course, is true of bows. Because bows are fired from a distance, you could potentially keep out of reach of your enemies and kill them before they could even reach you. However, bows require a lot of strength to properly draw and fire them, and so a lot of training is required to use them effectively. And that's why the different crossbows were invented. Crossbows were easier for the average soldier to use because you literally just needed to load up the bolt and draw back the bow with the loading mechanism in order to just aim and fire much like you would a gun. It tended to have easier accuracy and didn't cause extended strain for extended use. However, the disadvantage there in comparison to the bow is that crossbows tended to be slower firing. Going back to melee weapons, if spears provided such a good advantage with reach, well then why were swords and axes and maces used? Well, because each of these also had different advantages that spears didn't necessarily have. Swords are well known as being one of the most versatile weapons ever created. There is a reason why it became a mainstay and they became some of the most expensive and sought after weapons in their day. Likewise, axes saw use because they were cheap and readily available. Axes were tools that got repurposed into weapons oftentimes. And maces and hammers, of course, were renowned for their ability to crack through heavy armor, break bones, split skulls, and were incredibly effective in the correct situations. And for myself, reflecting that situational usefulness of the different weapons is something that I find incredibly enjoyable in my games. It's not something that's always going to work perfectly, of course, but it is something that I do like to put to the table, at least in some degree. But what about you? How do you like to utilize weapons in your games? What games do you think utilize weapons the best? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. While you're down there, please like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and open up that description box to follow me on my social media presences. Minds.com in particular is the best place to follow me, as that is where I back up the plurality of my content. Additionally, you'll also find a link to Phoenix Rising in the description box, my monthly fantasy adventure webcomic series that I work on with my good friend Hare Illustrations. If the idea of a classic fantasy adventure webcomic with a touch of intrigue and comedy and a good helping of heart is appealing to you, give Phoenix Rising a read. I am sure that you are going to find something in there to enjoy. And in the meantime, my friends, once again, I would like to say that my name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen, and as usual, I'd like to remind you all that in the world of tabletop gaming, you do not want to just sit back and watch, but get in there and game. Have a good one.